I'll speak about Libya and Syria, a little bit Kurdistan. Those will be a little bit more of my case examples, with Syria really being probably the most, the best case of issues of migration, of the vulnerabilities of victims of sexual violence regarding displacement and migration. As we know, in all three communities, victims, in particular women, fled their communities to avoid all forms of violence, including sexual violence. We often heard in Syria that families fled towns, being concerned about home invasions where their women, their wives, their daughters would be raped. So we've heard of whole communities even leaving for fear of sexual violence. Families fled to Jordan, Turkey, Lebanon, and Iraq, and we know there's over 6 million displaced people due to the Syrian war. In Libya, women fled to other cities, usually inside Libya, to IDP camps, to other community cities, but also to neighboring countries like Tunisia and Egypt, all in fear of Gaddafi's forces. Once again, also of home invasions and fear of rape. In Kurdistan, probably as many of you have followed, Yazidi families fled the Sinjar region for fear of ISIS fighters coming through, and as we know, capturing thousands of women and girls and boys, many that have been sold off to ISIS fighters, into Syria, also into other areas in northern Iraq like Tel Afel and Mosul. So those were the voluntary migrations. And in many of these cases, the men were either killed, went missing, or stayed behind to fight. So women now were the heads of households and the lone financial supporters of families, whether they lived in an IDP camp, a refugee camp, or in any of the urban areas. They've lost their male protection, and being displaced has made them especially vulnerable. Those who are known to be victims of sexual violence are even more vulnerable. Those women or girls may have been rejected from their families completely due to shame and dishonor, not only losing their means of living, but also their status in society and certainly within the family. They are now tainted goods. They may also suffer from medical injuries, diseases, infections, and of course pregnancies, and have suffered psychological trauma from the violence itself. In Syria, some women have been imprisoned and raped for months, and in ISIS-affected areas, we know Yazidi women and girls have been sold to ISIS fighters and enslaved and moved around to different locations. Some of these women and girls have escaped and fled to IDP camps in Dahuk in particular, and many of these girls lost their fathers and brothers who had been separated from them when captured, and those men and boys, generally the men were executed. So women and girls have returned to camps, to communities, living with extended families or on their own. So once again, we have women on their own, also supporting their families without the means to do so, without male family members to protect them. And it is a ripe environment, as you can imagine, for forced and early marriage, prostitution, or trafficking, which unsurprisingly has surfaced in all these areas. In addition, there are usually insufficient medical, psychosocial, legal, financial services for victims of sexual violence, and even all victims of war. Keep in mind, sexual violence survivors have suffered from sexual violence, but also bombings and shootings, missing family members, imprisonment, torture, many other factors in war. They have lost their homes and are now living in camps or isolated urban areas in a foreign country in unknown territory. Often not aware of their rights, are distrustful of the host country, or any typical protection mechanisms like the police, like military or government authorities. And oftentimes, as they know, these agencies are often the perpetrators. So this brings us to the challenges of documenting, investigating, and prosecuting cases which involve such displaced people. And that is, once again, my lens. I think many of you know the difficulties and challenges of being in displaced camps and being refugee camps, And I'll speak a little bit how it is as an investigator and potential documentation, investigations, and prosecutions of such cases. One of the obvious challenges and problems is locating and being able to relocate victims and witnesses of crimes. In Libya and Syria, underreporting was a major issue. Even learning who a victim was difficult. Not trusting or using the typical referral mechanisms you might have in other countries, such as the police or local authorities, did not exist. And when local services are not in place or being used, you don't have that avenue as a way to locate witnesses and victims. I know if I were a victim of a crime and I lived in a refugee camp, I would be pretty hesitant about telling my deepest, darkest, most shameful story to somebody. I don't know where that information is going to go. I don't know who's going to overhear it. I don't even know how, if a tent nearby is going to be listening, what is going to happen to this information. In the Syria context, we don't know who's going to be the victor of this war, so ultimately what's going to happen to this very private information. And there are also issues, of course, of wondering what will happen to you. Could you be deported if camp personnel, if authorities know about your secret? One of the challenges, as we see in Jordan, is that Syrians are not able to work. So you have Syrian doctors that are not able to treat patients. There are thousands of injured Syrians, injured from the war, those that have regular diseases that are not being able to get the treatment that they need. And also those doctors and psychologists are often the first responders. Often we'll hear the stories from the victims themselves. So you've just lost an opportunity for the victims to receive treatment from a fellow Syrian. It's much easier to tell another Syrian what has happened to you than a Jordanian when you don't know where that information might go to. They've lost the opportunity for treatment and the opportunity to tell their story, and ultimately for that information to potentially be used in a court or judicial process. And due to the nature of the displacement, it is hard to find corroboration, to find other witnesses, and to be building a case around a victim. So he or she is not alone with their story. And obviously with the difficulties of being able to find a victim in 2 years' time, I don't think there's any chance we're going to see a prosecution in 2 years' time. 5 years' time, 10 years' time, or as we're seeing in some of the Bosnian cases, it could be 15, 20 years before such a case goes to trial. And will we be able to find those victims and those witnesses again? Obviously, we won't have the forensic evidence. Usually in these cases, the medical evaluations are not able to happen right away. We're not able to get into the countries. There's a reason they fled, so you don't have that sort of corroborating evidence. So the lack of reporting, lack of services, lack of mechanisms to report, difficulties in locating victims and witnesses, and lack of general government support all make it more difficult to build a case in order to prosecute. I feel a little irresponsible in not also discussing what could be possible solutions. There is, as we can imagine, no easy solution. We all should be aware that sexual violence pretty much happens in every conflict. That is not a surprise anymore, should not be a surprise anymore. There are many indicators where we should be looking, where victims, male and female victims of sexual violence happen. Detention, prisons, child soldiers, recruitment, any separation of men and women, differences in power, armed militia groups, etc. So the mobilization of support for victims should be there immediately, not something that is going to come in later as a surprise, like, oh, okay, now we're starting to hear reports. We know those reports are going to come in slowly. So those response mechanisms need to be there right from the start. And as we are seeing with victims, that they're not reporting to the police as you might do here in the U.S. or in some other countries. They are often reporting very slowly to the people they trust. It is usually local civil society organizations. It is humanitarian aid organizations. It is generally not the UN as the first responder. It is generally not the international organizations. It's the local humanitarian and civil society organizations. And that is where the trust is going to begin. And the justice component is really going to come in at the tail end. Once the support, the services, the trust, the stories start to trickle out, then later down the road, justice can possibly come in. The reporting, the documentation, the investigation is really the tail end of it. Anyway, time is up, so I can try to answer more during the question section.
Thank you. Dale?
And thank you, Yasmin and Jenny, Columbia University, for inviting me here today. I come to you today very much as a practitioner in the humanitarian field. And I'm going to talk a bit about what we know about gender-based violence and conflict and crisis settings, what the humanitarian response has been to date, then a bit about what we don't know, and perhaps what we need to figure out as a community. So what do we know? I mean, you've heard this from Erin. We know that gender-based violence, I mean, we have the data, it increases in every single conflict, often exponentially. We have this data. We know why it increases. We know the traditional community support structures break down, law enforcement fragments. People are moving out of places they know into places they don't know. I mean, think about the Syrians arriving from a small village and they're suddenly in this Atri camp in Jordan with 120,000 strangers. That increases their risk tremendously, right? So we have data. We know, for example, at the height of the conflict in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, an average of 40 women a day were raped in North Kivu, and that 350 a month were reporting incidents of rape in South Kivu, reporting incidents. We know that during the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, between 250,000 and 500,000 women were raped. We know that during the conflict in Bosnia-Herzegovina, that between 20,000 and 50,000 women were raped. This happens in crisis after crisis. As Erin says, we don't need to prove this is happening. It's happening. It plays out in all of these crises the world over, and the humanitarian community has been tackling this issue, I would say, probably since the mid-90s, but perhaps with little to show for it, with little results. What is clear is that everything the humanitarian community does in the early days of response, in those early days of emergencies, either heightens exposure to risk or helps mitigate that risk. Where the water point is placed matters. How you organize the food distribution matters. The kind of shelter materials you distribute matters. And we often don't think that way. Everything we do is either reducing some of those risks women and girls in particular are exposed to, or heightening those risks. So what have our responses been to date as an international community? We've gotten pretty good at response services. Not always there, certainly not there at the beginning of a crisis, but we at least know what those are. The healthcare response, the psychosocial response, to a lesser degree, perhaps some legal assistance. We at least know what that piece looks like. But what we also know is that the number of people who report are a fraction of the number of people who have the experience of gender-based violence, right? We've also focused considerable energy on ending impunity, although I would say this is a really heavy lift for humanitarian actors. This is an area, and you heard a bit of this from Erin. Do we need to do this as a community? Absolutely. It is long, it is arduous. I mean, I've been involved with an organization that has been taking cases through the court system, mostly of girls, trying to get precedent-setting cases where the law is either not in place or is not being applied. And some of the cases we've been working on, we have been working on for 10 years without resolution. And why is that? You have court systems that are broken, you have court systems that are backlogged, you have court systems that are corrupt. They are not working for women and girls. And until those societies value women and girls in the same way, we're not going to get the results, I don't think, through those systems that we need. So what don't we know? We don't actually know how to do prevention. Like I said, we're okay with responses. We at least know what needs to be there, but we don't know how to do prevention. I would say as a whole, our prevention efforts have been weak, largely ineffective, and perhaps even misguided. We've raised awareness. In fact, I was talking to one of the GBV experts in the humanitarian community some time ago and mentioned this to her, and she said, you know, you're right. Our GBV prevention is about talking to people about GBV. We've also done some work in terms of prevention on engaging men and boys, but I would argue that much of that is focused on engaging men as potential perpetrators rather than as traditional protectors and providers and potential role models and champions. And I think we need to come at this with a different entry point to get the results we want.